Hey everybody, we're back for part 2 of the digestive system, and now we're going to delve into vertebrate digestive system. So we'll look at just the overall structure and how each organ of the digestive system functions. And so remember, in vertebrate digestive systems, it's basically a big long tube that we refer to it as the gastrointestinal tract, or it's also known as the alimentary canal. So a lot of different names for that. And then associated with the canal are several accessory organs. So again, these are structures that food does not pass through. Okay, so it's not part of the tract, but they're accessory organs associated with the tract. So that's your tongue, your teeth, the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas. Okay, and here we can see it lengthened out for you, give you a little bit better idea of the how everything is connected to one another within this long digestive system. And what's interesting is that from about the mid portion of the esophagus down to the anus, the GI tract has about the same general structure in animals. Okay, and we don't include the mouth because you just saw that the mouth parts are what really form a lot of diversity in order to specialize for different types of food and capturing of food, right? So, but the rest of it, there's a layer of epithelial cells along the inner lining, and then of course you have the connective tissue, and then muscle to help move the material through the tract, so this is found throughout the length of it. And then you can also see, as this is pulled apart into the different functional organ systems, you'll see that there are also functional regions. So for example, in the oral cavity, this is where ingestion takes place, right? Bringing food into the body. Okay, and then the esophagus is going to propel it downward to the stomach. And stomach can be a place where the food is stored. Okay, and then it gets digested in this area as well. Okay, from there, it'll move into the small intestines. It will continue digestion in the first part of the small intestines, but then it will move to the areas where absorption takes place. The intestines is about 30 feet long in a human, and so the reason it is so long is to help complete digestion and then also have a lot of surface area for the absorption to take place, so that we can absorb as much of the material that was digested as possible. And we absorb all of it. Okay. And then the last portion in the large intestine, it's to process the waste to get it ready for elimination out of the body. So then the waste gets stored in the rectum and gets eliminated through the anus. So that was a real quick overview of the digestive system. So let's go over each section part by part. And one other thing I want you to recognize, and again, you can really see it here, is that with these different functional regions, they're actually separate environments for digestion to take place. So remember, I mentioned in the part 1 of the video that food gets broken down based on specific enzymes. And so if you remember, if you took general biology or you remember from high school biology, enzymes are a protein. And remember that proteins function best under a specific temperature or pH, right? And so if the temperature gets too high, that will denature enzymes and denature proteins and then enzymes, and then they're not functional anymore. And pH can do the same. Well, in our bodies, the temperature is pretty much uniform. It doesn't change too much. So that's not specifically affecting the enzymes within the digestive tract. But the pH can be different. And different enzymes, again, work best at different pHs. And so with these different compartments, these different cavities within this digestive system, we can create a separate environment with a different pH. So for example, the mouth has a pH of about 6.7. So remember, a pH of 7 is neutral. And so 6.7, as you get into the lower numbers, it's slightly acidic. Okay, so 6.7 is slightly acidic. So the enzyme amylase that is secreted from the salivary glands, it works very well in that pH. Later, then we'll see food gets swallowed into the stomach, and the stomach produces hydrochloric acid. So that makes the pH of the stomach anywhere from 2 to 3. That's very acidic. So any amylase that gets swallowed down with the food, it gets denatured right away. And so we stop breaking down that food, that amylase, okay? Because amylase doesn't function anymore. Then when food leaves the stomach and it goes into the duodenum, there's secretions to neutralize that acid. And so the pH in the stomach, in the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, goes back up to 6. Still on the acidic side, and still more acidic than in the mouth. But the enzymes that are secreted in that environment work best at about a pH of 6. And then when you get to the jejunum, it's like between 7 and 9. And then when you get to the ileum, it's about 7.4. So those are the other segments of the digestive system, of the small intestines. And by then, we're not digesting anymore in the jejunum and the ileum. But still, we've changed the pH in those areas. And because there are other proteins that might function best under a more neutral to basic environment. So that's one of the advantages of having a GI tract like this, separating all the different compartments into different environments that can, and we can manipulate that environment so it functions optimally for those enzymes found in that area. Okay, so let's start in the mouth. Okay, so here we are in the mouth. The mouth, we already kind of looked at the teeth. So we saw that different teeth can help process the food. So we need to mechanically break down the food within the mouth. The tongue helps with that, right? The lips can also help keep the food inside of the mouth. It can help procure the food, right? But then we need to start to produce fluid inside of the mouth. We need to mix the food with water. Remember that water, it's not only a transport medium, but it's the solvent where chemical reactions take place. So we have 3 major salivary glands, the parotid gland, the submandibular gland, and the sublingual glands. So there's a pair of each one of those. This is only showing one each. Okay, and they each produce saliva that travels through the duct that you can see that goes, empties right into the cavity of the mouth. Okay, so most of it is water, but it also contains electrolytes and protein. The protein is mainly in the form of our first enzyme called amylase. This is salivary amylase. And so amylase breaks down carbohydrates. Okay, so we already in the mouth start the digestion of carbohydrates. Okay, there's another protein in there called lysozyme. This is a chemical that can destroy bacteria. So we just brought something from the external environment to the internal environment. And so we want to make sure that we destroy any bacteria that could harm us before we swallow it down. Alrighty. And then let's see what else. Oh, mucus. Mucus is also released through the saliva, and that just helps to provide lubrication. Okay. So now what we do is we start to process this food and chew it, and we mix it up with the saliva. Okay. And let me blow this up for you. So here you can see at the top that kind of that yellow mass, that's referred to as a bolus. We manipulate the food, and again, we have a little bit of digestion occurring here from the amylase, so breaking down our carbohydrates. And we're forming the food into this kind of a soft ball called a bolus, B-O-L-U-S. Okay, and so now we want to see, well, what happens with swallowing? Okay, and so normally with swallowing, the tongue will push the bolus into the tube right behind the mouth called the pharynx. Okay, and so as the bolus enters the pharynx, you see the soft palate above kind of gets pushed upward, and it closes off the cavity into our nasal cavity. So the food bolus gets conducted downward. So this is voluntary control. You make a decision, I'm going to move my tongue and start to swallow. Okay, tongue is skeletal muscle, so it's voluntary control. And then the muscles in the pharynx and the upper portion of the esophagus are also voluntary control. But then once it hits about the oropharynx down to the esophagus, then it's involuntary control. Once it hits there, then you start to get waves of contraction of the smooth muscle all the way down the esophagus that you can't stop from happening. That's the involuntary peristalsis. Okay, peristalsis are these waves of contraction. Okay, and that conducts then the food down into the stomach, and it passes by a sphincter, and I can show you that on the next slide here. There you go. So you can see the esophagus, the tube toward the top, and then right below it, right at the entrance into the stomach, is the gastroesophageal sphincter. So this is a band of skeletal muscle that stays contracted until food presses on it from above, and that causes it to open. But as soon as the food bolus passes by it, it'll pinch shut again. And that's because we want to prevent the juices from the stomach to get up into the esophagus, because the juices from the stomach are very acidic. Okay, so we don't want that to get up into the esophagus. When it does, that's that condition called heartburn. All right, that people think feels like your heart is burning. That's because the esophagus passes right behind the heart. It's actually burning of the tissue from the acids that are coming up through the stomach. Okay? So if the esophageal sphincter is functioning correctly, you should be able to prevent acids from moving up from the stomach. All right, so once the food gets into the stomach, we can store the ingested food there until it can be emptied into the small intestines, right? But while we're storing it there, we work on the digestion. So we'll have gastric juice secreted into the body. So the stomach is a large container, a cavity, right? And it produces hydrochloric acid inside of there. And hydrochloric acid has a couple of functions. It can help just break down real tough cellulose and protein material. It's not a digester, but it's helping to break fibers down, right? And protein material like from meat and things, real stringy, tough connective tissues. It just helps to break big pieces down into smaller pieces, but it's not a chemical digestion. Okay, it's not breaking bonds. All right, so it's just helping to process somewhat. But then the other thing is it's associated with the enzyme that gets released. Well, the stomach will release a inactive form of an enzyme called pepsinogen. In biology in general, when you see something end in O-G-E-N, ogen, then it's an inactive form of something. Okay, and so the reason it's released as an inactive enzyme is because cells deep within the tissue of the stomach makes this enzyme, and it's a protein digester. So most of the components of your cell are made out of protein. So if you excreted an enzyme in its active form and it had to pass through some tissues, you would digest yourself on the way out. So it releases an inactive form. And once it comes in contact with the hydrochloric acid, it's a big molecule, and that hydrochloric acid kind of breaks a portion of the molecule off, and it becomes pepsin. And pepsin is the active enzyme. And so now it will digest protein. So remember up in the mouth I said we had salivary amylase, and that's working on carbohydrates. And as the bolus is that ball of food. In the center of that ball of food, there's carbohydrates and the amylase are working. But when that ball of food, when the bolus hits the stomach and it starts to mix with the hydrochloric acid then denatures the amylase and we stop digesting carbohydrates. But we work on the protein portion of the food. Okay, so pepsin will start working on that. And then we'll see that there are muscular contractions of the smooth muscle walls of the stomach. There's like 3 layers of smooth muscle. And so it can contract and it can mix the contents of the stomach. Okay? And all the while, you see at the end of the stomach, the pyloric sphincter. So that's another sphincter that forms, it pinches shut, forms a barrier between the stomach and the small intestines, and it doesn't release the food until it's ready to go. Okay. Let me show you the next picture here of the stomach, and it kind of shows you the layers of smooth muscle. So it's a very muscular organ, again, because we need to really mix the content when we have all that, what we call gastric juices in there. And there's also mucus and things like that. So we want to mix all of that up. And because the more mixing there is, that means the enzyme comes in contact with more of the protein that's within that food stuff, and it breaks up, mechanically breaks up the food stuff as well. Okay. So again, once the food gets mixed up in there, it starts to really break down into a liquid, and we call that liquid chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, chyme. And it's that liquidy stuff that will be secreted into the next part of the small intestine called the duodenum. But again, that pyloric sphincter is going to remain closed until we're ready to release it. Okay. Before we talk about that, though, I want you to look at the inner lining of the stomach, and that's where we have the epithelial tissue. Okay, so there's epithelial tissue in those folds, or it creates those folds. And so it's within that epithelial tissue. Remember, epithelial tissue are mainly cells, and the cells specialize, and they form, they are the ones that are making the different secretions. So there are specialized cells that make hydrochloric acid, specialized cells that make the enzymes, and specialized cells that make the mucus, right? And so we can see some of those here. So the very first cell you see all the way to the left is a chief cell. And the chief cell is what makes the pepsinogen. Okay? Right next to it is the brown cell there. That's a parietal cell, and that makes hydrochloric acid. All of the other cells are mucus cells. They make a mucus, and you can see it forms a layer over the top of all the cells, and that mucus has bicarbonate associated with it. Bicarbonate is a buffer. It can take acids and turn them more and neutralize them. So you see there in that layer, in the mucus coating, there's a pH of about 7. That's what's protecting our own cells from the hydrochloric acid that's being excreted out of there by the parietal cells. So in the container of the stomach, the hydrochloric acid is making that area, that environment, a pH of 2. But if I ask you to hold out your finger and I was going to put a dropper of pH 2 acid on your finger, you should run away screaming from me, because that will burn your skin. I would never do that to you, don't worry. That will burn your skin. So this pH of 2 in our stomach could actually burn the lining of our stomach, but it doesn't because of the mucus coating. So that mucus coating protects us. Okay. Sometimes that mucus coating can wear away, and you do get a little sore in there. You get a burn. That's called an ulcer. An ulcer, U-L-C-E-R. Okay. And so it's just a wearing away of that mucus lining that causes the ulcer. So we want to make sure that that mucus lining stays intact in order to protect our stomach. Okay. So here's some little differences in other animals. So we were using a human as an example, but here's the digestive system of a bird so far. And one of the things with birds and many other invertebrates, they don't have teeth, right? Birds have a beak, but they don't have teeth. So what they do is they'll take in whole pieces of food and just swallow them. And so you can see at the end of the esophagus there's actually a modified portion of the esophagus called the crop. The crop. And that can store the food and ends up, there's fluids in there that can soften the food. Okay, so they store it in the crop. And then it can move down. There's the proventriculus, and that's part of the stomach, and that secretes enzymes and acids, right? And then there's also the gizzard. And many times you'll see animals like birds eating pebbles. And that's okay, you can let them do it, because what they're doing is the pebbles are being swallowed down into the gizzard, and the gizzard can also help pulverize the food. So it'll move from the proventriculus to the gizzard and back, and as the food moves around the pebbles in the gizzard, it helps to pulverize it. Okay, and then you reach the intestine, where there's more digestion occurring and the absorption of food, which will see the same thing. Alrighty. One of the things, again, when birds feed their young, right, they can put the food in the crop and soften it and then regurgitate that out back to their young. And the crop can actually secrete a solution. It's lipid-rich water solution, and that helps to nourish the young. Sometimes that's called crop milk, if you've ever heard of that. Here's an example of an herbivore. So herbivores, remember, they have to digest cellulose, but they do actually lack the enzyme cellulase. So they have to use microbes or bacteria within their gut to help break that down. And those that have a simple stomach, a one-chambered stomach, just like us, then their microbes are in the cecum, which is part of the large intestines, but that helps to break down the cellulose. Okay. Let's see, so the picture I have here is a ruminant. A ruminant is an animal that has a complex stomach. That means it has several chambers. Okay, and so you can see that from the esophagus, you have 3 lower pouches that branch off of the esophagus. They're actually a part of the esophagus. And that's called the rumen and the reticulum. Those are the first 2. And that's what contains cellulose for digesting microbes. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. That contains microbes that digest cellulose for the animal. What I was trying to say was cellulose digesting microbes. Okay, so microbes actually can digest the cellulose for them. So again, those with a complex stomach, those microbes live in the rumen and the reticulum rather than the cecum, part of the large intestines. Okay, and then you see the third pouch there is the omasum, and the omasum can absorb some of the water and also some of the salts from the food. So we start to get some absorption right away. And what'll happen is that in order to help continue to process the food, since plant material is very difficult to break down, it will actually then regurgitate that food that's been mixing around in the rumen and the omasum, and bring it back up the esophagus to the mouth to re-chew it. And when they do that, we call the food the cud, C-U-D, cud. And so we say they're chewing their cud, and then they swallow it back down, and they'll keep doing that back and forth. And then eventually it'll get down into the obomasum, which is the true stomach. Okay, and we call it the true stomach because that's what contains the acids and the enzymes, just like we talked about before. Alrighty, and then it'll move again once digestion is completed into the small intestines. And so that's where we'll go next, using our human as an example again, the small intestines. Okay, so the small intestines is a very large organ. It's about 30 feet long or so. The first segment is the smallest part. It's called the duodenum. It's only about 10 inches long. Remember though, so far in our digestive process, we started digesting carbohydrates in the mouth, but then once it hit the stomach, we stopped, so we didn't complete that. Then the stomach started to digest proteins, right, with the use of pepsin. But then before we're finished digesting proteins, we actually release the chyme into the duodenum. Okay, and remember the duodenum is now at a pH of about 6. So pepsin doesn't work anymore. And we haven't even really significantly digested any lipids, right? So digestion gets completed in the duodenum. So the first 10 inches of the small intestine is still a digestive function. Okay, and along the inner surface, it's highly folded and it's got enzymes embedded in the cell membranes of those folds. Those are called brush border enzymes. Because it's highly folded, it looks like a brush inside of there. That's why they refer to it as the brush border. And it's here. So the duodenum itself, though, doesn't make any enzymes itself. There's some embedded in the lining, but it has to receive significant enzymes from the pancreas and from the liver. Okay, so we're going to talk about that next, but let me just kind of finish the rest of the small intestines. Then from the duodenum, it becomes the jejunum, which is about 8 feet long, and we get nutrient digestion or absorption there. And then the next segment is the ileum, which is about 12 feet long. And that's where we absorb much of the water. So we excreted a lot of water in this process. So we reabsorb a lot of the water that we use and also obtain water from the food that we ate, right? And so it's the ileum that absorbs that. And then there's also minerals and vitamins associated with that. Okay, so let's go back. We've got to continue talking about the duodenum, but let me show you here the length. I just kind of mentioned that in the human, the length of our small intestines is about 30 feet, but it can vary, it can vary in different animals depending on their specialization of food. So I mentioned before that omnivores and carnivores have a pretty similar length of the the GI tract, right? But herbivores have an extremely long small intestines. It's even longer. And the reason is because it's very difficult to digest plant material. And so herbivores need a much longer digestive tract to do that. And in fact, we humans as omnivores, it's been found that our digestive tract is just barely long enough to digest plants. And we're not even efficient plant digesters. Okay, so a lot of plant material gets passed through as what we call fiber, right? And that pushes through the large intestines, kind of cleans it out. So if you're having a hard time going to the bathroom, people say, eat your fiber. That's one of the reasons why. We can't digest it very well. Carnivores have a shorter digestive tract than omnivores do, but not by much. So again, we're pretty similar. Ours is just barely long enough to be able to digest food. Okay, so let's get back to the duodenum because we need secretions from 2 organs in order to complete digestion. So that's what you see here. This is a pretty complex slide, so I'll stay on it for a little while. Let's start with the pancreas. That's that yellow organ you see down there. It's actually underneath the stomach. So we took off the stomach in this picture so you could see the pancreas. The pancreas is filled with a bunch of cells, and these cells can make enzymes as well as bicarbonate. And then you can see there's a duct that travels right down the center of the pancreas, and it picks up these enzymes and bicarbonate in the form of fluid, and that duct empties it into the duodenum. So again, the digestion will occur in the duodenum, but it needs the enzymes and the bicarbonate from the pancreas. And I've listed for you on the slide there the main enzymes that are released by the pancreas. There are more. It can get pretty complex, but I wanted to show you one of the main enzymes that gets released is called trypsin. It actually gets released as an inactive form called trypsinogen, just like you saw with pepsinogen. But its job when it becomes trypsin in the duodenum, it further breaks down the protein. So it finishes the digestion of protein. We continue the digestion of carbohydrates then, and we have that similar enzyme that we saw in the mouth. We have amylase, but this is generally referred to as pancreatic amylase because this one works best at a pH of about 6. Remember, in the mouth, it was about 6.7. Okay, but we can break down carbs. And then this is the first time we see any significant digestion of fats. And so we have an enzyme here called lipase. Lipase, so that's a general type. There's actually many different types of fat enzymes, but so in general, we refer to it as lipase because that sounds like a lipid, right? And lipids are fats. Okay, so all of that gets secreted by the pancreas into the small intestine, into the duodenum. But remember, the chyme that's coming from the stomach is acidic, right? There is a pH of 2 or 3 in there. So what happens is that sphincter, the pyloric sphincter, only allows little squirts of enzyme or little squirts of chyme to be released into the duodenum. And so because of that, the pancreas can also release that bicarbonate and neutralize the enzyme right away. Okay, or neutralize the chyme right away. And then the pancreatic enzymes can work. So it continually, as we squirt more chyme into the duodenum, more and more bicarbonate gets released to keep up with the neutralization. And then it doesn't harm the it doesn't harm the enzymes coming from the pancreas. Okay, so lipids are pretty hard to digest. And so even though we have the enzyme lipase, we also need some help from the liver. So the liver creates a substance called bile. It contains salt in it, and it contains bicarbonate ions. And so the bicarbonate ions also help to neutralize the acids, but the bile salts help to what's called solubilize the fat. So if you think of when you put oil and water together and you mix that up together, the oil kind of forms a big lump. Right? When you shake it, you'll break the oil droplets up into smaller droplets, right? But if you leave it alone, those droplets will go right back into a big lump again. Well, that's the same thing that happens inside of our digestive tract. So these bile salts, they can get in between the individual lipid molecules or make the droplets much smaller. I shouldn't say it gets in between the individual molecules because the enzymes do that. But it makes the droplets smaller so that the enzyme can fit. The enzyme can work on it. Remember, so enzymes and their substrates are like a lock and key. So the size of it actually matters. So lipid droplets can be too big. So these bile salts help to break it down. All right. And the liver makes the bile, and it can store it in the gallbladder. And so it stores it in the gallbladder until we're ready to use it in the duodenum. And so a hormone, cholecystokinin, a hormone, will actually cause the gallbladder to contract. It's muscular little pouch. And when it contracts, it squeezes it, squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. And you can see that the bile would travel down that duct and empty right into the duodenum. So we continue the digestion inside of the duodenum. Then you can see where it leaves. The next segment of the small intestine after the duodenum is the jejunum. And so the jejunum and the ileum both are absorptive surfaces, right? They have to absorb. So here's a close-up of what it looks like inside of the ileum and the jejunum. Even the duodenum kind of looks like this. It's very folded. Okay, it's got these finger-like projections called villi. There's one villus there. And within each villus, there's capillaries and there's a lacteal. So when the nutrients get absorbed across the epithelial cells, they get into the capillary. And so with the folding of the lining, remember we said in order to increase surface area, we can fold things up. And so that's what's happening inside of the small intestines. It's nice and folded. Now you can see that the food can come in contact with more surface area to be moved across those cells and then into the capillaries. The lacteal is there to absorb lipids because the blood is mainly water, so it has a tough time carrying lipids or fats. Remember, fat and water, lipids and water, they don't mix very well. Right, and so it will actually get absorbed into the lacteal itself, and the lacteal then can modify the lipids so that it can travel, hook it onto a protein that can then travel in the blood later. So there you see now that continuity between the digestive system and the circulatory system. So now the circulatory system can distribute all of those nutrients all around to every cell in the body. So that's the end of the digestive process. So by the time we get through, like I said, the jejunum will absorb the nutrients, and the ileum will absorb the water and minerals and some vitamins. Anything left over then will continue into the large intestines. And that's basically what's left over, are waste products. So the large intestine's job is to concentrate that waste product, dry it out, and compact it into fecal matter. The way it dries it out, though, is it can absorb more salt and water. Okay, and we do have bacteria associated with our large intestines that can help to form the vitamins that we have. So some of the food stuff that we can't digest can be formed into vitamins. I think I merged the slide onto the next one. I forgot to erase it. There it is. So now you can look at the large intestines as I talk about it. So you can see from the ileum, there's an ileocecal valve. So the material coming from the ileum gets pushed into the first part of the intestines, which is called the cecum. Okay, and again, that's mainly where the bacteria are housed, where they can help us produce vitamins. So we live symbiotically with bacteria. They're very important inside of our gut. Okay. And then the waste material moves upward, and it's by contractions of the smooth muscle in the large intestines. It moves upward into a segment of the large intestine called the ascending colon. Right? And that goes up the right side of your body. And then just about under your liver or so, toward the back of your body, it takes a turn toward the left side, and that portion is called the transverse colon. And then on the left side of your body, it turns downward again. That's called the descending colon. And then the last portion, there's a little curve. That's called the sigmoid colon. So all along the way, the fecal matter, again, we're absorbing the water, the bacteria is working on it, we're making vitamins, we're absorbing that, we're absorbing electrolytes. Those little pouches in there are called haustra, right? And what they're doing is they're compacting the waste for us. And so by the time it makes it all the way through past the sigmoid, it goes into the next organ, which is at the bottom there, called the rectum. And that's where we store the waste product until we're ready to let it go. Hopefully we're ready to let it go. Well, how do we control that? We control that through two muscle bands that surround the anus. So the anus is the opening to the external environment where we would release that waste. All right, but we want to control that, don't we? So you can see there that there are two different sphincters. There's one on the upper portion of the anus, and the inner portion, those are called the internal sphincters, internal anal sphincters. Looks like two, but it's actually, a circular sphincter, right? It's just cut in half here. And that's involuntarily controlled. So that stays contracted until pressure from above, from the waste, from the feces, starts to press on that sphincter. That'll send an automatic nervous reflex to open it. And that's when you go, I have to go to the bathroom, right? Luckily for us, we have the external anal sphincter, right? That you can see below the internal sphincter. The external sphincter is skeletal muscle. The internal sphincter is smooth muscle. Remember, smooth muscle is involuntary. But skeletal muscle we can control. So when you feel that internal sphincter release and you feel that pressure, you can control the external anal sphincter, and you keep that closed, hopefully, until you get to the appropriate area, where then you can relax it and let the waste out, right? So hopefully you are in the appropriate area. Okay, so that's under voluntary control. Now, what's interesting is that the internal anal sphincter can develop earlier in a baby's life, when a baby's first born. But the external sphincter doesn't fully developed until, and you don't have full control over it until about age 2. That's about the age where we potty train children, right? And so parents sometimes who get really tired of diapers, they want to just potty train their child at maybe 18 months. And usually what happens is the child just gets frustrated, just gets upset because they're not wearing a diaper anymore and they're going all over themselves. And that's because the external anal sphincter hasn't developed yet. So you got to give them time. And some develop a little earlier, some later. And so you got to just kind of read your child. They'll start to let you know when they're ready because they want to imitate mom and dad, right? And so they kind of let you know when they're ready to ditch the diapers. Okay. And when we do the urinary tract, we'll see that we have a similar relationship of internal and external sphincters around the urethra. So it's the same thing for urinating as well. Okay, that's it for digestion. All right, hope you guys had fun. Hope you learned a lot. Thank you very much.